Hey folks, today we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. Really important guy, Chaucer, and the Canterbury Tales is considered to be one of the foundational works of British literature. If you ever study English literature written in English in college, you're going to run into the Canterbury Tales. It's in like every Western world literature book ever. And Chaucer is enormously famous. You know, when you look at most famous writers in the English language, most widely recognized, most well-known, most influential. He's number two, right? Like number one, we all know is Shakespeare. As soon as you say, who's the most famous British writer? You're like, oh, William Shakespeare. But right under him is Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, some people might argue that it's John Milton who wrote Paradise Lost, but I think they're wrong. Chaucer is incredibly famous for a number of reasons. Let's jump over to his Wikipedia page here for a second and talk about him. And we're going to read a little bit about him. There's tons of information here on this Wikipedia page, and it's always worth your while to go through and read about your authors and learn something about them. I studied Chaucer I encountered him in high school. I encountered him again in college, and I studied him in grad school. And just for my own interest, I took I checked out at the library a 5-hour video lecture on Chaucer and watched it. And I learned a ton about him. So I'll try and add embellishments here. But if you know your author, all art is autobiography. They can't help but putting their own perspective, their own understanding into what they're reading, and this into what they're writing. And this is exciting with Chaucer because he's the first named author that we have. Like Beowulf had an anonymous author, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight had an anonymous author. We don't know anything about them, but Chaucer's life is remarkably well recorded, and we have lots of information that helps us understand what he was writing and how he was writing it and why, and all of those kinds of things. So I highly recommend reading his Wikipedia page and getting more information than I'm going to give you in this quick little lecture. So let's start with the first paragraph here. Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340s to 25th October 1400, was an English poet and author, widely considered the greatest English poet of the Middle Ages. He is best known for the Canterbury Tales. That's what we're going to read. We're not going to read all of it, by the way. It's really long and too long to really handle. And some of the stories are great, and we're going to read those stories. And some of the stories are not so great, and some have not aged well and have all kinds of medieval prejudices and things like that. There's some anti-Semitism and stuff like that shows up in Chaucer. Sexism is all over the place, but that's medieval attitudes. You can't expect an author from a long time ago to have values that fit with modern day values. And we can learn a lot about the changing values in society by looking at literature in particular. It's easy enough to say, hey, I'm gonna read history, but history is sort of sterile. History is some modern voice looking sort of back through the backlog of events and putting them in an order for you, whereas literature is like taking a slice of life out of the past with all the past context written by a past voice, and then you can analyze that. And I really think they have to be taught together in order for history to make sense. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. Let's get back to what we were saying. He's been called the father of English literature, or alternatively, the father of English poetry. He was the first writer to be buried in what has since come to be called Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Chaucer also gained fame as a philosopher and astronomer, composing the scientific treatise on the astrolabe for his 10-year-old son Louis. He managed a career in the civil service as a bureaucrat, courtier, diplomat, and member of parliament. Among Chaucer's many other works, The Book of the Duchess, The House of Fame, The Legend of Good Women, and Troilus and Cressida, he is seen as crucial in legitimizing the literary use of Middle English when the dominant literary languages in England were still French and Latin. That's the key. That's why we call him the father of English literature, the father of English poetry, because he's the first guy to say, hey, I'm writing in English. Remember that when the Norman conquest happened, these Norman French guys came over and made themselves a nobility, and so they were writing in Norman French. And all of the literature of England was actually written in French because it was written for people who spoke French in their everyday lives. And it wasn't until King Henry IV that the language of the nobility shifted to Middle English, and King Henry IV was the final king under whose reign Geoffrey Chaucer worked. He may be partially responsible for that shift. I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. So he's kind of a big deal. He's the first guy who said, hey, let's go back to writing in English, and he changes things. So we're going to jump to a textbook now and look at their introduction, what the textbook authors think that the average 12th grade student needs to know about Geoffrey Chaucer. And as I read that, I'm going to embellish it. I'll give you more details that I think are important or just interesting about Chaucer. So here we go. Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400. Geoffrey Chaucer made an enormous mark on the language and literature of England. Writing in an age when French was widely spoken in educated circles, Chaucer was among the first writers to show that English could be a respectable literary language. Today, his work is considered a cornerstone of English literature. That's true. Nice metaphor there, too, by the way. Befriended by royalty. Chaucer was born sometime between 1340 and 1343, probably in London, in an era when expanding commerce was helping to bring about the growth in villages and cities. His family, though not noble, was well off. They were middle class. They were merchants. And his parents were able to place him in the household of the wife of Prince Lionel, a son of King Edward III, where he served as an attendant. Such a position was a vital means of advancement. The young Chaucer learned the customs of upper-class life and came into contact with influential people. It may have been during this period that Chaucer met Lionel's younger brother, John of Gaunt, who would become Chaucer's lifelong patron and a leading political figure of the day. Pause. So we can add to this, I think, a little bit. Chaucer was born to middle-class parents, but they were wealthy. They were doing well in trade. And so they sent their son to work with the nobility. Prince Lionel of Antwerp was one of the sons of the king, a younger son who was never going to be king himself. But what ends up happening is Chaucer ends up being a page in that household. And being the age he is, he gets a lot of education alongside the kids of Lionel. And, I think this is important. He also ends up meeting another younger brother, John of Gaunt, who is incredibly important to him because he becomes his patron. He pays for his artistic endeavors and things like that as time goes on. But you get a sense that Chaucer, being from sort of the middle class, he understands the middle of that feudal pyramid pretty well. Also, his father would have interacted with people lower down than him on that feudal pyramid, so he would understand sort of the bottom end. And then he goes into a royal house and understands it. So he understands the spectrum of medieval life in a way that somebody who was born in the nobility never could, because they would just understand what the nobles know. Anyway, we'll keep reading here. Whoa. Is that as far down as it goes? Let me pause this and get the screen thing. A knight and a writer. Although Chaucer wrote his first... This page is just slightly too big for me. Important work around 1370. Writing was always a sideline. His primary career was in diplomacy. During Richard II's troubled reign, 1377 to 1399, Chaucer was appointed a member of Parliament and Knight of the Shire. When Richard II was overthrown in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV, Chaucer managed to retain his political position, as Henry was the son of John of Gaunt. This is kind of a big deal. Chaucer... he becomes a member of Parliament. He also gets a job, as like commissioner of the wool trade in England. And as you can imagine, because you deal with presidents in the United States, when a new king ascended the throne, generally speaking, the custom was to get rid of all the people in the positions of power and authority and replace them with guys who are loyal to you. And this almost invariably happened. What's interesting about Chaucer is he makes it through three kings. He goes from Richard II to Henry IV, and then when Henry V becomes king, he stays in his position. So he was very charming. He was very good at his job. This is a job that traditionally has a lot of corruption, and people would get in trouble for corruption, and he never got in trouble for any kind of corruption. So interesting. He became a member of Parliament as well. We can go back to the Magna Carta and Parliament and how that happens, but that's for history class, not literature. It doesn't really factor into understanding Chaucer in any case. So anyway, Let's see. Despite the turmoil of the 1380s and 1390s, the last 2 decades of Chaucer's life saw his finest literary achievements: the brilliant verse romance Troilus and Cressida, and his masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, a collection of verse and prose tales of many different kinds. At the time of his death, Chaucer had penned nearly 20,000 lines of the Canterbury Tales, but many more tales were planned. Chaucer had planned 120 tales in the Canterbury Tales. He only wrote 24 before he died. So it was going to be this enormous work, but he never obviously got it finished. And it doesn't have a clear conclusion, which some people say might mar the work, but I think if he wrote more, it would be so daunting that nobody would have read it. Anyway, uncommon honor. When he died in 1400, Chaucer was accorded a rare honor for a commoner: burial in London's Westminster Abbey. A rare honor? This is a astounding honor. It's not something that happens with commoners. In 1556, an admirer erected an elaborate marble monument to his memory. This was the beginning of the Abbey's famous Poets' Corner, where many of England's most distinguished writers have since been buried. Yeah, let's talk about Poets' Corner for a second. So, Chaucer was so well loved by the kings of England that when he died, they buried him in Westminster Abbey, where the kings get buried. Now, he was shoved off in a corner somewhere, and there was no real marker to mark where he was buried. It was erected later, but holy smokes, to be a merchant's son in a highly feudal society where there is no movement up or down the feudal ladder, to be knighted, to marry a landed noblewoman, and to be buried in Westminster Abbey with the kings is just nuts. And since then, the place where he is buried is called Poets' Corner, and the most famous poets of England are buried there. And so you can go and you can see a number of poets. Now, what's interesting is Shakespeare was not buried there because he wasn't famous when he died. He got famous posthumously after his death, and so he was never buried in Poets' Corner. But there's a number of authors who we're going to read and learn about in this class who are buried in Poets' Corner. My favorite story of Poets' Corner actually comes from the Victorian age. There's this poet named Thomas Hardy who was really, really famous when he died, and they offered to bury him in Westminster Abbey, but he wanted to be buried next to his wife, but he also wanted the honor of being buried in Westminster Abbey. And so what he did is he wrote sort of in his will before he died that he would accept the honor of being buried in Westminster Abbey, but that they would have to remove the heart from his corpse and bury his heart with his wife and his body in Westminster Abbey. So that's kind of my favorite story of Poets' Corner and Westminster Abbey. But Chaucer's the guy who started that. So let me give you a couple more details about Chaucer that may help you out with understanding him. He's incredibly literate. He learned to read and write English probably before he became a page, but in the service of Lionel of Antwerp and dealing with his children, he became multilingual. So he knew English, he knew French, he knew Italian, he probably knew Spanish. He could translate them all. And he actually, when he became a statesman, when he became a diplomat, it mentions that here. He under King Henry IV, he became a diplomat, and it was because he was so multilingual and because he wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't in any kind of danger of being captured and ransomed and things like that, not for a large price or anything. And so they would send him between armies whenever there were conflicts, whenever anything happened. He would travel around Europe and he would communicate with the rulers of other courts. So he was meeting rulers all over the place, and that's pretty awesome. Actually, he did get ransomed once. This is a fun story too. He was captured in battle, and generally, when noblemen are captured in battle, the king has to pay a ransom, has to pay a price to get the nobleman back. But when people who aren't noble are captured in battle, nobody cares. They usually get executed or whatever. But people realize the importance of Chaucer, and they ransomed him back to the king. The king actually paid, I can't remember exactly how much, but it was the equivalent of 2 years' wages for a worker to get Chaucer back. And so Chaucer was returned to the king, which shows just how important he was to the king and the royal family. So I think that's interesting. Another sort of fun Chaucer tidbit that I just think is awesome. Apparently there was a poetry contest in in the castle. And Chaucer tried to enter, but it was for nobility only. And so essentially they were like, no, you can't enter our poetry contest. And Chaucer was like pretty gutsy about it. I think he said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, oh, well, if you're scared that a commoner is going to beat your nobility at poetry, I understand. And, and so he was entered into the contest. Not only was he entered into the contest, but he won. And the prize for the contest, which Chaucer won and enjoyed for the rest of his life, was a pitcher of beer every day for the rest of his life, brought to him by a servant of the king. And so think about this. Every afternoon, some servant would come with a pitcher of beer for Chaucer, and he'd just be able to drink that. It's like the greatest prize of all time. It's pretty fun. So I think that's enough Chaucer information for you to understand who he is and what's going on with him. Let's talk about the Canterbury Tales itself a little bit. The Canterbury Tales is a unique piece of writing. It's different than anything that was written before it, aside from, like, I guess this thing, hold on one second. If it's modeled on anything, it's modeled on the Decameron by Boccaccio. But it's really just modeled on that, and then it's a frame story or a frame narrative. So actually, that's probably the first place to start. And I'm going to do a terms video in a minute that will go over these terms for you and give them to you in writing. But a frame story is, a story that is within a story. So like you've got this outer story. The easiest thing to do would be to look at some examples. I don't know what it is with Tom Hanks movies and frame stories, but like Forrest Gump, if you've seen that, or Saving Private Ryan, if you've seen that, or I guess Inception would be a good example of a frame story. So you got this outer story that is not really central or not really the important bit, but it ties the other story together. So like in Forrest Gump, you got Forrest sitting on a bench waiting for a bus, and he's talking to a guy, and he's telling the story of his life. And what's interesting is this serves as a frame, this sitting on a bench waiting for the bus, that connects all the other elements of the story and allows him to skip to bits and move around. That's what a frame narrative is. Saving Private Ryan starts with an old guy in a graveyard looking at a grave, and then it flashes back and tells the story of the grave that he's looking at, and then it comes back to him in the graveyard again at the end. And so we've got this frame about the old guy in the graveyard around the central story. And what goes on in the Canterbury Tales is it's a frame story. So basically the story is that there are these pilgrims. Now, pause again. In America, especially around Thanksgiving, we use the word pilgrims, and you all picture these guys with like buckles on their hats and buckles on their shoes who are like eating turkey and talking to Native Americans. No, that's not who we're talking about here. A pilgrim is somebody who goes on a religious journey, and the pilgrims are called the pilgrims because they went on a religious journey to escape persecution in England and found a colony in the United States. So a pilgrim would be somebody who travels to Jerusalem or to travels anywhere, to Mecca. Something like that. In this case, a common pilgrimage in England before there was any kind of major transportation except for horses was to go to a place called Canterbury. Canterbury is in southeast England, 3 days journey from London. And people would go there because there was a saint, a guy who was sainted, Thomas Becket. I think this king called Henry II had him killed. And he was a martyr. Anyway, the rumors were that you could pray to his bones and worship at his church, and miracles would happen, especially if you were sick. You would be healed and things like that. And so people tended to go in groups, especially in the spring, to Canterbury to visit these bones. And so the Canterbury Tales are the tales told by pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. So the idea is like there's this inn at the beginning of the road to Canterbury, and Chaucer is staying at it. Actually, fun fact, Chaucer lived above the Pilgrim Road to Canterbury, so he saw pilgrims going to Canterbury like all the time, and it was very familiar to him. He probably went down in the inn and had dinner and talked to pilgrims not infrequently. But anyway, the story goes that 29 pilgrims are on their way to Canterbury, and Chaucer joins with them. So he's a character in his own story. And they're all going to travel 3 days to Canterbury, pray at Thomas Becket's tomb, and then travel 3 days back to London. And it's going to be super boring. And so what they decide to do to pass the time is they're going to have a storytelling contest. And every pilgrim is going to tell 2 stories on the way there and 2 stories on the way back. And whoever tells the best story is going to be treated to a free feast paid for by everybody else. And so the real meat of the Canterbury Tales is the tales. It's the stories that are being told for the storytelling contest. The contest is being judged on 2 criteria: morality and pleasure. So the stories have to teach a moral lesson, and they also have to be entertaining and fun. And so all of the characters start telling stories. Again, Chaucer only wrote 24 of them before he kicked off, and so he never was able to finish the Canterbury Tales, and we don't know who won. We have to sort of judge that for ourselves. But it's a frame story. So it's going to start with a prologue that takes place in this inn called the Tabard in London, where all the pilgrims are going to meet. And we're going to meet all of our various pilgrims, and then we're going to travel from there to Canterbury with them, listening to their stories along the way and judging them for ourselves, and listening to the host who's going to be judging them as well. So the whole thing is a frame story with a storytelling contest. One of the exciting things about this is it allows for a couple of opportunities and a couple of things that were never done before, in England anyway. Number one, the pilgrims come from all walks of life. We've got a knight who's sort of the top of the pyramid on this pilgrimage. This knight has a squire who's a knight in training, but you can go all the way down. There's a peasant at the bottom. There's merchants in between. There's monks and abbots and nuns and church officials from that church feudal pyramid, and they're all traveling together. There's a cook and a miller. And so what you end up with, and one of the reasons that the Canterbury Tales is so famous, is a slice of medieval life. We just chop that feudal pyramid down the middle, and you get to see every level of it as you read the Canterbury Tales, and you get to understand medieval society in a way that maybe you couldn't before. And so that's particularly interesting. You get that. But not only do you get a slice of every level of the pyramid through all of your various narrators, but you also get all the different types of medieval genres. So Chaucer is really showing off his writing talents here. He writes high comedy, that's sort of funny and about the nobility. He writes low comedy, which is about peasants and lewd sexual humor and fart jokes. He writes satire, which makes fun of things like the church. He writes medieval romance, which is what we have already read, but he also writes satire of medieval romance that makes fun of it. He writes religious devotions. He writes fables. He writes ballads. He writes morality plays. Like, all of the famous kinds of literature of the Middle Ages are told in the Canterbury Tales. And so Chaucer is able to say, hey, look, I've done it all. And it gives you, as a reader, a sample of all the various kinds of writing that were popular in the Middle Ages. And that's another reason it's famous. It's also famous because it's so avant-garde. He takes on the church, like the Catholic Church. I mean, look at Beowulf, look at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Both of these things are very pro-church because the church was powerful. And Chaucer is going to say, hey, we got some problems with the church. But he gets out of it because he's smart, because he casts this as a true story. He doesn't say, I made this up. We all know he made it up, but he tells you it's true. And that way he can say, hey, look, I'm sorry that this is insulting to the church, but I didn't say it. This partner guy said it. I am just an honest person, and so I have to report the truth. Right? And so he's created this incredible document that sort of catalogs medieval society and medieval storytelling and tells the truth in a time when people really often didn't do that, and tells the truth about everybody, not just sucking up to the nobility or sucking up to the church like so many other poems do. So I'm going to close this down here, and I'm going to give you a lecture on medieval literary terms that appear specifically in the Canterbury Tales, and that you can use to help yourself understand what's going on. But the structure of this is going to be a prologue, which is the frame, tells us about going to Canterbury, and we're going to meet all of the characters. I guess one other thing I should mention here is Chaucer is also very pioneering in narrators. If you've noticed up to this point, the narrators of stories are really just that voice of God, sort of storyteller narration. Even Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which had a bit of an invasive narrator who would occasionally ask you questions and stuff, it was just the voice of the storyteller. Chaucer is adding a level of complexity here because every story is told by a different narrator, and he's jumping into their minds, and so you've got shifting narrators throughout the entire story. The prologue is told from Chaucer's point of view because Chaucer is ostensibly the guy who's writing the story. But then when the miller starts telling his tale, we go into the miller's mind and tell the story from the perspective of a miller. Same thing with a knight. We go into the knight's mind and tell the story from the perspective of the knight. So we're shifting narrators, which is cool and new and different. Anyway, after the prologue, we're going to jump directly into a couple of the tales and look at those. We're going to read the Pardoner's Tale and the Wife of Bath's Tale. Those are the two that we're going to read. I'll summarize some for you. And if you're interested, if you like them, I highly recommend going off and getting yourself a copy of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and reading some more of them for yourself. All right, thanks.